My name is Rob Davies. Now, I should say that I was an inaugural speaker at the keynote speaker at the 2019 Mountain Towns, along with Jane Goodall and Paul Hawken, and you better believe I have a screenshot on my computer of my picture with Paul Hawken and Jane Goodall. Since that talk, I've not been back to a Mountain Towns, and in fact, I had to have some colleagues make the application for this for them to let us back in. So, I'm kidding, of course. But just for those of you who don't know me, I'm trained as a physicist, and by the way, I think we did well, you guys. We're up against like 6 other sessions, so you got to have a provocative title, and that's what I think it worked. I'm trained as a physicist, but an unfortunate sort of atmospheric physics and climate physics and quantum optics, but an unfortunate conversation I had in 2006. I went to the wrong pub at the wrong time at the university I was researching at in the UK, and met some people from the Environmental Change Institute there, and that conversation has kind of led to where we are today. So I kind of abandoned quantum optics. So I'm not feeling snubbed that on my birthday week, the Nobel Committee once again did not award me the prize. And so I moved into this world of climate communication and climate change, but that quickly leads, as all of you know, to energy systems, food systems, economic systems for sure, all of the hard sciences, and then of course all of the harder sciences, the social sciences, human behavior and all of that. And so over the last 18 years, I would say that what this has morphed into is the world I work in is global change and civilizational futures. We're going to come back to that in just a second, but I resonated with Bill McKibben yesterday when he said he feels like a professional bummer outer. I kind of view this as my work these days. So I'm going to apologize up front that there is some heavy material in here, but I think this group in particular is well aware of that. What we're going to do is, for 2 days and for most of the last day, we've been talking about climate change and energy systems very intently and wonderfully, and there's so many people doing excellent work. Thank you all for who are doing that in your communities. But I want to broaden the context. So what I want you to do is take all the climate change and all the energy systems and put that out of your minds. And I'm serious about this, so close your eyes for a moment. Take a breath. We're not talking about climate change. We're not talking about energy systems. We're just talking about our place on this planet as humans. Okay, so that takes us to this world of civilizational futures. And it's kind of an interesting, sort of occupation in itself, and it's exactly what it sounds like. We're talking about humanity and the state of humanity and the state of the planet in some place. This is where we are, we'll call it, and at some point in the future, of course, we're going to be somewhere else. That is ostensibly different, the state of the planet and the state of humanity. And so the first part of the story, of course, is where we are, and we can characterize that in lots of different ways: scientific, philosophical, artistic, humanistic, all of that sort of thing. But I want to just do it as simply as we can. And I'm going to do it from a metabolic, a biophysical standpoint. We're going to characterize the state of where we are as a civilizational metabolism, the state of humanity, a flow of energy and materials and waste coming into and out of civilization. And we can characterize that with just a couple of metrics. We are currently, roughly speaking, a 20 terawatt civilization. That's our continuous flow of energy, and a 90 billion ton annual extractive global economy. And we can turn that biophysical language into economic language, where our global GDP is a rough proxy for our civilizational metabolism. It's about $100 trillion a year. So this is our civilizational metabolism, the flow of energy, materials, and wastes. And the question embedded in the biosphere, is this a sustainable civilizational metabolism? And the answer to that, quite robustly through a number of frameworks that I'm not going to go into today, tells us that no, this is nowhere close to a sustainable civilizational metabolism. We are now in a state of what we would call overshoot of the planet's biophysical capacity. And that means that this is a temporary state. It will not last. Overshoot, unsustainable by definition, it will not last. And so we can characterize this further by how deep into overshoot we are, and it's very deep, nearly a factor of 2. Our civilizational metabolism is now nearly a factor of 2, too big for the planet to support. Now you say, well, how can you consume more than the planet can support? You can do it for a while in a state of overshoot, just like you can sprint for a while, but you can't keep it up. And so eventually that's going to change. And so there's clearly something wrong with my picture here, which shows our future state as still being in overshoot, but we know that's not going to be true. It is guaranteed that at some point in the future, we will not be in overshoot, by definition. And so the question of the work that I do is all about what do these states look like once we're within our the Earth's biophysical capacity. And by the way, as long as we stay in overshoot, we are eroding the planet's ability to sustain us. So there's a certain level of biocapacity, but every day that we stay above that, we are eroding that biocapacity. It actually gets smaller and smaller as we go. So the situation becomes more and more precarious. So what do these states look like, and how do we get there? So here's one trajectory that looks what we would want to do. We are going to metabolically right-size to the biosphere. And this is one path for that metabolic right-sizing. We'll call this metabolic right-sizing by design. It is planned, it is structured, it is restorative, it is not chaotic, it is not destructive. And clearly this is the way we would like to do it. This is the preferred course. And again, in the work that I do in Civilizational Futures, we look at what are the core design principles and boundary conditions for creating what I'll call an ecological civilization that's biophysically sustainable, socially just, culturally vibrant, a much nicer state than we exist in globally today. So what are the boundary conditions, design principles for that, and also for the trajectory that gets us there? And the good news is there are frameworks for this. Not blueprints, but frameworks, design principles that tell us how we can build such a state and how we can get there. So this is a big piece of the work that I engage in along with a fair number of colleagues around the world. But of course, there are other ways and other states that we could end up on. We could continue in our trajectory to go deeper into overshoot. Eventually, that sprint ends up in some form of collapse. We have seen this, of course, many times in human history in various civilizations on a regional scale. And that collapse can take sort of different pathways in itself. That can look very different, but ultimately the notion is you build up these ecological disruptions which then interplay with the society and build up social disruptions, and the wheels start to come off the cart, right? You start to unravel. And we'll call this metabolic right-sizing by disaster. It is not planned, structured, or restored. It is unplanned, it's chaotic, and it's destructive. And this is what you get if you don't do this. If you choose not to metabolic right-size by design, what you will get is metabolic right-sizing by disaster. And there are sort of two stable destination states for this metabolic right-sizing by disaster. Sometimes in systems dynamics, they're called attractor states that are stable. One of those is the things pile up so big and so fast that you just sort of collapse into chaos. Another, and that we have seen that in civilizations in the past on regional scales, and another state is collapsing into authoritarian dystopias. And we have also seen this happen, play out civilizationally throughout human history. And so clearly neither one of those is attractive. So the question is then, what are we doing? What is our current trajectory from here? And unfortunately, we have enormous amounts of resources, intellectual power, financial and material resources being poured into this route right here. And we don't call it deepening overshoot. What we call it is economic growth. But biophysically, what it means is we're a factor of 2 into overshoot today, and we're looking to become a factor of 4 into overshoot in the coming decades, and a factor of 8 into overshoot in the coming decades after that. And what the data tells us very clearly, ecological and social, is that from a risk management standpoint, there's almost no chance we get to much deeper into overshoot. And so that path takes us here, which takes us currently into these 2 stable attractor states that we were talking about. Wouldn't it be so much better, of course, if we were pouring all of our intellectual might, all of our resources, into figuring out the thing that can actually be done? Not that, but this. But that is not the case right now. So again, this is the work that I work on in this world of civilizational futures and with the Institute for Planetary Thinking and my work at Utah State University. So that takes us to our question, which I think is the only reason everybody's here, is like, oh, I want to go find out. You have to take your last where you can get them in this business, right? So the answer to that question is it depends on what we decide to do now, what kind of planning we start to engage in now, because we would say that we are already on this trajectory right here. And I would, in sort of full disclosure, I would say that certainly from my perspective, from my many colleagues around the world who work in this space, based on enormous amounts of data coming in, and not just data, our embodied knowledge. You may not know all of the facts and figures, but we feel quite a lot of dysfunction, I suspect, in this room. And that tells us that this route now is essentially off the table. We've waited so long, we're so deep into overshoot, and we're focused so hard on doing this thing that taking this path is now really highly unlikely. And so what we have is some level of intensifying ecological and social disruptions facing us as we move forward, going from some places some of the time to most places most of the time. And what I want to say is a big piece of the work now that I do and that the people in my world work on, and my colleagues that are here with me today, is to say, okay, we're going to be bumping down this hill in some fashion. Can we interrupt that and get ourselves back onto a track over here? And our answer to that in the Institute for Planetary Thinking is what we need is millions of minds as fast as possible directing their energies towards this path and understanding the context in which all of this is unfolding. And once we understand what the actual design principles are and have that spread out among all of the talent that's working on these things now, then maybe we have a chance. I like our chances if we apply our innovation to the actual right problems. So this is where I work. Just to put the cherry on top, I think the data is very clear that from a risk management standpoint, we have to assume that this path is unfolding now, and we're down into here on a decadal scale. We're in the window. 1 decade, 2 decades, 3 decades, 4 decades. There are things that we're doing that might buy us some time. There are also things that we're doing that will accelerate that time frame. I realize that this is not pleasant to hear, and it can be very shocking. So we're going to talk about that as well. We'll just take a moment to acknowledge that. But this is not, and I always feel like the guy in the tinfoil hat with the end is nigh sign standing on the corner. There is so much scientific data telling us, so much embodied knowledge telling us this, that we live every day. And so this is the context of the work that we are engaging in, and all of you in this room, as we move forward. These are just frameworks to tell us about. Now, I should say that I'm not going to go any further into that scenario. If you want to know more about that, if you have lots of questions, and I'm assuming many of you do, and you want more information, reach out to me. I'll give you some information at the end. I'm happy to schedule long conversations with whoever is interested. But we're not doing that today. So we're going to take this moment. I first want to ask you just how do you feel? And this is a serious question. This isn't meant to be. Take a moment and just kind of think about it. We've been very focused on these very narrow boundary solution paths of deploying low carbon energy and replacing high carbon energy. We've been calling it clean energy for the last 2 days. It's not clean. It's low carbon. It has enormous footprints to it. And despite some of the information we heard yesterday downplaying those footprints, I can say that, yes, the material footprints are less than fossil fuels, but they are still massive when it comes to our impact on the planet and on other people. So putting this in the broader context, this is certainly a place we can go. And if we try to think about the whole thing all at once, it can be debilitating. The way that I get up every day, and I think many of you do, is I don't try to think about getting to the top of this mountain that no one's climbed. I think about if we were to get to this top of the mountain, if we were to get to the top of this mountain, what would be next? And there are so many answers to that question. And so many of you in this room are working on the answers to those questions. And what I want to do now is we just open up the scope of that, the context of the work you're doing, to give it a broader context so that, yes, you're still going to be doing that work, but understanding the broader context, and this may change the way you decide to go about doing that work. That's the point here. And once we understand the context and the frameworks that help us understand this, we can move from a mindset of despair and overwhelm to a mindset of resolve. And stealing a couple of words from our speaker this morning from Uruguay, another physicist, by the way. This is what gives us the power to then face difficult questions and come up with original answers. And we are so good at doing that. I mean, we are incredibly clever, incredibly innovative. I just want to turn that cleverness and innovativeness towards the problems that can actually be solved, doing that on the pathways that can actually unfold. So this brings us to this notion of authentic resilience in our communities. We're used to doing resilience the way that I've been hearing about today. There's going to be some acute event in our communities. We need to weather that event. We need the systems that provision us to weather that event. And then we're going to get help from the state, from federal agencies, and we're going to recover to a baseline normal. That's the sort of standard resilience planning. But the kind of resilience I want to bring us out to is suppose that baseline normal isn't coming back. Suppose the ecological and societal disruptions just keep intensifying. And so here we're not necessarily talking about buttressing the systems that we have, systems that are actually quite brittle under lots of conditions, but actually rethinking the entire systems themselves. And the good news is lots of people have been doing this. And the mountain communities, of course, are a pretty special place for this because there are some very common features in mountain communities, which I think we've all talked about. Economies depend intensely on tourism. They are often isolated with 1 or 2 or 3 ways in and out. And often depend on large numbers of workers who are not able to live in those communities. And I'm not telling you anything you don't know. I live in a mountain town myself, though it's not a resort town. We still face some of this. So from here, I want to, here we go. Here I want to introduce Tanya to give us another example of a situation we heard a couple of yesterday with Aspen, with your fire, Winter Park, with your avalanche and your snowstorm. Tanya Jackson had an experience like this a year or 2 ago that I want you to take us through that kind of highlights this notion. So, and we just need on the side there. That's the clicker.
Thank you, everyone. Again, Tanya Anderson. I'm the Ecosystem Stewardship Administrator for the town of Jackson, Wyoming. Jackson is located in northwest Wyoming, is the gateway to Grand Teton and Yellowstone National Parks. So this is our valley, town of Jackson there, part of the 3% of Teton County that is not public land. And we have 3 roads in and out of our community. That might be familiar to a lot of you in mountain towns. One to the north basically leads to hundreds of miles of national park to the north or national forest to the east. It's fairly wildfire prone, also in some areas avalanche and landslide prone. To the south, we have a steep river canyon, and that goes about an hour south to where a lot of people live who work in Jackson in the Alpine area. It is also prone to avalanches, landslides, and wildfires. And then to the west goes over to Teton Valley, Idaho, Victor and Driggs, if you've heard of them. Steep mountain pass prone to avalanches, landslides, and wildfires. 43% of our workforce commute in on one of these roads. Almost all of them come in on the western route or the southern route. So last year, in June, you may have heard on the news, there was a major landslide, something that we've been told to expect more of due to climate change and some of those conditions in the future. completely knocked out the road over Teton Pass to Idaho. Beginning of the tourist season, it was, kind of mid to late June, coming up on the 4th of July, and that's what the road looked like. That meant that people commuting from Victor over there, what on a good day is 40 minutes, but usually more like an hour in summer rush hour, had to go all the way around here. This said it would be, an hour and 40 minutes to 2 hours, but then you've got, all these extra people commuting on it. It actually made it closer to 2.5 hours for most people, and anyone commuting from the south also had delays in that hour that they were normally commuting every place that they went. Is this my last of the slides? I think, or is there one more?
You got one more.
Okay.
No, there we go.
No. Okay. I'll stay here. And, what I came to share really briefly is what we did, how it worked, and kind of what we learned from it. So immediately when this happened, we're used to avalanches closing the roads for a day or two, short-term things. People opened up their homes. I opened up my home to people who needed a place to stay, who worked at the hospital or different places. People opened up places for RVs to park where people could camp out longer. There was a former senior living center that was being developed into affordable housing. They opened it up, like tons of housing where people could stay. That's what we need. We need people who work over there to be able to stay closer to work. Honestly, I think I only had 2 nights that people stayed at my place during this period, because actually people have families where their home is. They have pets, they have gardens, they have horses, they have elderly parents. They have responsibilities, and they can't just move into an RV in your driveway permanently during a situation like this. Our town runs the transit, and we have commuter routes over here. We changed the commuter route. So our commuter route was taking people all the way over. This affected our workforce, the drivers, but taking people 2.5 hours each way. And we considered adding more buses so that people wouldn't have to drive that. And what we found was that people were taking the bus less, because a person who's willing to take their 1-hour commute and make it an hour and 10 or hour and 15 minutes to add in that, that extra time of taking the bus and appreciate not having to drive that, we're not willing to make a 2.5-hour commute 2 hours and 45 minutes. They needed, they didn't want 6 hours of commuting a day if they were doing 5. We did have some people who, worked from home. They worked remotely. That, we learned how to do that during COVID. We had other people who just did not work during that period. And we had other people who quit their jobs. What we learned was that people's tolerance for this commute was 2 weeks. YDOT dropped everything, came, got a route opened in 3 weeks. This is a best case scenario. It was, this was the end of the school year. There were only 2 days left of school or something like that. So school wasn't affected really. Fastest timeline ever to get the route opened back up, and now they have a permanent solution about a year later. There wasn't a wildfire blocking the other route. Really a best case scenario, but 2 weeks was when people who were already fed up with the commute said, I'm leaving my job, I'm gonna do something else, I'm not gonna work in Jackson anymore. So I think that's really all I wanted to share, is just, this was a major emergency, major disruption, but it only lasted 3 weeks in a best case scenario with people pouring out their hearts with food and shelter and additional bus routes. And in the end, like that, it's not gonna work for longer than 2 weeks for that type of thing to happen. So I'll pass it back.
So thank you so much, Tanya. So the notion is, and we heard a couple more of the examples of this yesterday, fascinating. And this is the kind of acute thing that of course one would expect in these kinds of, and they will continue. But the question for the rest of the day is, we want to take ourselves through just a thinking exercise. We certainly don't expect to answer lots of questions, but this is the exercise to start really opening our minds up into thinking about what if. The situations we heard about yesterday, the situations that Jackson experienced that Tanya has told us about, were happening in a different context. In the context that I just outlined, where we have external to these communities, nationally and globally, intensifying ecological and social disruptions going from some places and some of the time to most places most of the time. And that starts to affect, of course, our ability to get outside help. And that starts to erode that notion of a baseline normal. And of course, we have a recent example of this, and I think Heather will mention that in just a second. So this is where we want to start changing about a different kind of resilience than the kind of resilience that we've mostly been talking about for the last 2 days. Heather.
Thanks, Rob. So for the rest of our time today, we are going to run you through a scenario. And our goal here is we want you to look at this through the lens of authentic resilience. Like Rob said, we're not talking about bounce back to the status quo, because that is rebuilding brittle systems. Anyone remember COVID? Anyone need toilet paper? We live in a 6-continent supply chain currently. As Rob has demonstrated, that is probably not going to always be there. We take for granted that our ability to access resources, the things that we need to function in our communities, will always be there, that we can get on Amazon Prime and get it delivered by drone in 4 hours or 10 minutes or whatever. So what we're going to do is we're going to run you through a plausible, even likely multi-year scenario of increasing environmental and social disruption for our typical American mountain towns, set in the context of this increasing system breakdown. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read you through the scenario. Allie's going to be handing out pieces of paper, and there are a series of questions on this paper for you to think about going through as we're living through this scenario. And we're imagining that it is not going to be a 3-week fix. Okay, so here's the scenario.
Can I interrupt for just a second, Heather?
Yes.
So, and as you do so, we kind of put a couple of list ups here, thinking about what are critical skills that one needs, especially if your 6-continent just-in-time supply chain is not working. Critical provisioning systems, food, water, energy, sanitation, healthcare, security. And most importantly, I just want to say this notion of thinking about relational resilience. And so that's certainly relationships between ourselves, but also how we relate to the land, how we relate to the creatures on the land, how we're relating to the future generations coming along who are going to be living in our communities as well.
So as we're doing this, we're talking about how do we prepare to meet these crises that are inevitably coming? How do we navigate the crises? And then, where the authentic resilience comes in, how do we look at this from a systems perspective so that we're building thriving, just, resilient, regenerative communities that can adapt and thrive in this new landscape that none of us have ever existed in? So here's our scenario. Year 1, late winter. Energy prices spike globally after a sudden geopolitical escalation involving a key oil-producing region. This was the third such spike in 18 months, and unlike the previous 2, it doesn't come back down. Spring, a persistent drought worsens across key U.S. agricultural regions, California, the Midwest, and food prices skyrocket. Supply chains begin to stall. Summer, the second consecutive summer of flooding, hurricanes, and wildfires leads to massive evacuations and strains regional emergency response systems. Many evacuees seek shelter in cooler mountain regions. Fall, federal support is delayed due to overlapping crises in multiple states and lack of federal response. In-migration of displaced people leads to local housing, water, and health system pressures. Winter, tourism drops drastically due to economic hardship elsewhere, but the number of full-time residents grows. Housing prices increase. Winter storms and ongoing geopolitical turmoil disrupt supply deliveries for extended periods. Local roads are cut off twice. Grocery shelves remain largely empty for weeks. Year 2, the spiral. Spring again. Several large trucking and rail companies collapse under rising fuel costs and staffing shortages. Regional systems begin to localize by necessity, but infrastructure is not sufficient. Better? Okay. Regional food systems begin to localize by necessity, but infrastructure is not sufficient. Local governance begins to fracture. Some want to close borders to outsiders, others push for mutual aid. Political polarization surges. Mental health challenges explode. Critical care resources are stressed beyond capacity. Suicides and interpersonal violence increase. Teachers, nurses, and other essential service providers begin to leave town, and their vacancies are not filled. Federal government reduces disaster response capacity, or FEMA doesn't exist. Municipalities are told they're on their own. So we have these discussion questions that we want you to go through in groups where you're sitting. So we're looking at what breaks first in this scenario. So if you think back to COVID, instead of supply chains recovering quickly, imagine they don't get better and there are more disruptions. So what breaks first? Is it food systems, staffing, medical access, transportation, water, trust among people in your community? And then we want you to go through and try to identify the top 3 community assets that you already have in place. Then we're going to talk about recovery and look at what we would need to shift as we're looking about how we do recovery when we don't have that external support from the federal government and we're not looking at a return to normal. Number 4 is dynamic resilience. What would a dynamic resilience approach look like for your community if you were to respond to this differently, thinking that it wasn't only going to be a 2-week or a 3-week or a 8-month issue? What do you wish you'd started 5 years ago? And then some reflection questions of what this might all be bringing up for you as we look at this new world. So we're gonna take some time. Everyone's gonna break out. You can either just talk amongst your table or get into small groups. If you need to go out into the hallway or outside for some extra room, you can do that. But then we're gonna come back at.
So we've got 20 minutes for this. We're gonna come back at just, let's call it just 15 to 20 minutes. Come back at 25.
So be back here at 25 and we'll debrief.
We'll wrap up for 5 minutes after that.
All right, guys, we want to make sure that we have time to share some insights.
Hey,
All right, everybody wrap up.
We've just got a few minutes left. We wanted to have just a little bit of time to hear just a little bit of what you guys were talking about. So, Heather, go ahead.
All right.
I've got the microphone, and whoever sticks their hand up, I'm going to.
So first, let's just all take a deep breath. This is it's kind of heavy, we know. All right, so who wants to? In 23 minutes. So we just want to get give you guys a chance to share and hear what come up in other groups. So what were some of the most insightful or terrifying or impactful things that you guys discussed among your groups?
Okay.
Oh, they got the answer.
You've got the answer. We're fucked.
We're fucked.
Okay.
Wah, wah, wah.
Stick your hand up. I'll give you the microphone. The most interesting thing something interesting that popped up in your discussion. I don't know. Surprised you? Interested you?
So we said, while yes, we are fucked, but our group, I think we kind of looked at it. This is an opportunity in the event that, the mass chaos happens to not return back to the status quo. Because at the end of the day, I think for us, the pressure to get back to the systems that we have built and that we are, living among right now and brought us to where we are not working. So it's an opportunity for us to stop, pause, reset. We live in these rugged communities that may be a little more difficult that's to live in, without the systems, electricity, all these things. But that will keep the strong will survive. But there's an opportunity there to, change. I think, yeah. But yes, we are fucked.
Well, you brought up something very clear, I think, which is the whole premise here is to navigate this, and we don't solve this problem, we navigate this predicament, right? It's communities that get us through. If you want a bunker with guns and dry goods, be my guest, but someone with more guns and ammo is going to come take it away from you. Community is where we get our resilience. So something else that surprised you or interested you or, yep. No, they need that they're recording, so they want me to.
What surprised me is that we in the mountain towns might end up being the migrants because our food systems are broken. And during COVID, we were the recipients of the migration and felt really holier than thou because of it.
And that worked up because the so-called essential workers, which certainly were, showed up. But suppose it becomes harder and harder for them to show up, and they can't. Something else.
I hate to get dark on you, but in addition to being strong, we also flirted with the idea that survival of the wealthy. And so if we're in mountain towns and we have, there are communities that are too hot, or you're in a place where, you're drowning because of sea level rise and you want to go up to the mountain, we may be inundated with refugees, but we may be inundated with refugees with money. Right, you know what I mean? So there is going to be possibly, if we don't survive as a community, we're going to be fighting for limited resources, right? If we're inundated. So in other words, not only might we be refugees, but we might be in our own community is kind of taken over. I don't, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Yeah.
Real quick, just one thing that came to me right away, in a town at 7,000 feet that only has 1,250 people, we need to start building greenhouses now. And that what's going to happen is a bunch of people are going to move away because it's going to be too hard, and only the hardcore are going to stick it out, and we're going to have a really cool core of hardcore people with greenhouses that are still surviving.
I just have to say, I feel like when people have talked about community and needing community, our mountain town communities, hopefully you feel like we already have like a bond that will make us stronger to begin with. I'm from Crested Butte. I live up in Mount Crested Butte. I'm a town councilor there. I was blown away by my community during COVID. Yes, there was community action to actually close our county to incoming people because we knew our medical infrastructure couldn't handle anymore. Simultaneously, our community really took care of each other. One, we already had, because we're so remote, we already have a lot of infrastructure that is meant to support our community, like everybody listens to the radio station, like the public radio station. So that was a common source of like information on a daily basis. Two, we had business owners that went out for grants to buy food from the local restaurants that were already going to be shut down, that were already on contract, to give back to the people. So basically the money that was, they paid the restaurants made food and took the produce and the other goods that they were already getting, and we had free farmers markets for 30 weeks for anybody, not just for like, oh, if you're in need. No, come with your bags, keep 6 feet apart, and we're gonna feed you. And we had like, bonfires, we had like music, in the parks. Like it just, I saw our community come together in a way that made me feel like if this goes down, this is exactly where I wanna be. We need food, but everything else, we're good.
So I'm gonna, we're out of time. I want to close this up just briefly. So first of all, we're going to stick around. The next thing isn't until 4. We're going to be here. Come up and talk, or talk with each other. The whole point of this was to get our brains thinking along these lines. I want to, as strongly as possible, another quote from our speaker this morning. Be brave enough to be crazy. We have to think about how we do these systems on a community level. And I hadn't even thought about the radio thing. I mean, when you need a community to coordinate, you've got to have just good communication. And that's like, so building these systems that are useful to us anyway, not just when things are falling apart. I'll say that I'm so interested in this work. I've been thinking long term for so long. I woke up like a year ago or maybe 2 years ago and said, I live in this community, and in order for us to do the longer term work, our community needs to function in the shorter term. And that is now at real risk. I can say that the billionaires who've been out there building bunkers, and we've all read the stories and we all know that that's true, a fair number of them now, and I'm into some of this community just as a result of the work I do, they're selling their bunkers to the newbie billionaire schmucks who think that they can ride it out in a bunker. think that their security people aren't going to feed them to the pigs when they find out that their money's not worth anything. The resilience here is in community, and in the critical provisioning systems and in our relationships, and that includes our relationship to the environment that we live in. This is just to get our brains going. I certainly don't have claim to any wisdom on how to do this, but I do know, I mean, after these last 2 days, there are so many amazing minds in this room working hard on these problems. Keep working on those problems, but we need to think about it from this broader perspective. And I'm just going to make one quick plug, which is the economic growth thing is killing us. And it is going away. By design or by disaster. So as we move forward, thinking about how we're structuring our communities and businesses, and what businesses do we actually want in our communities, and what businesses maybe aren't really serving well-being, then I think that just changes the way that we go about approaching all of this. And that's maybe the point of this exercise. Feel free to reach out. We've got a website, planetarythinking.org. I'm at Utah State University as well, and send email here or at the university if you want to have longer conversations about any of this. So thank you all, and we'll be here for a while, and we'll see you later.